Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Google for Work Atmosphere event, Creating a Culture of Innovation. Over the next hour and a half, we'll learn how to think creatively and innovate boldly from business leaders and successful innovative companies. I'm your host, Callie Ressler, and author of Why Work Sucks and How to Fix It. I'm at Google today to show you the flavor of innovation that Google offers its employees. But first, let's discuss today's event and what you'll get out of your time with us. The next 45 minutes are full of advice from well-known business leaders. You'll hear from the CEO of IDEO and author of Change by Design, Tim Brown, as well as head of people operations at Google, Laszlo Bock, and the dynamic CMO of Airbnb, Jonathan Mildenhall. These three speakers are going to walk us through a blueprint for creating a culture of innovation. First, we begin with finding innovation. Where do our innovative ideas come from? Then we discover how to cultivate innovation within our teams. And finally, we'll learn how to accomplish business innovation and how one company disrupted their industry. After these keynote sessions, we will have 2 sessions happening at the same time. You get to take your pick between a collaboration track and a security track. If you'd like to learn the 3 attributes of productive teams, please watch and participate in the collaboration track. If you're more interested in how Google for Work technology makes businesses more secure and agile, tune in to our security session. If you have thoughts or comments during the event, please share them with us using hashtag Atmosphere15. Now let's jump into our first keynote and the first step toward innovating boldly and thinking creatively. I'd like to turn it over to John Merrifield, a Google for Work Googler, who is sitting down with Tim Brown of IDEO to discuss finding innovation. Where do innovative ideas come from?
Thank you, Callie, and welcome everyone to our session on finding innovation within. I'm sitting here at the IDEO office in San Francisco with CEO Tim Brown and also best-selling author of the book Change by Design. So Tim, thank you for being with us today.
You're welcome.
Now to start out, you talk about innovation and creativity in a lot of different settings, but is there a formula for creativity?
There's no formula, but there are certainly things that we can be thinking about that help us do it better.
Okay.
The way I like to think about it is that there are mindsets to do with innovation and creativity. So ways of addressing the world. And one of the underlying ones is this idea of creative confidence, which is our natural ability to have new ideas and then the courage to act on them, actually do something, because that's what creativity ultimately is all about, right? And there are various ways we can go about that help. One of them is to be confident in challenging assumptions. Why are things happening that way? Why does the world work the way it does? I mean, unless we're curious, it's very hard to come up with new ideas. Another one is sort of reframing the problem, often by asking a different question. Okay. So if the obvious thing is, how do I solve this thing that's bugging me? The interesting question would be, well, why do I do that thing at all? Or why do we do that thing at all? Is there a better way of approaching the problem in the first place? So this idea of reframing is often the way people get to the most creative, kind of the most disruptive ideas.
So tell me a little bit more about asking the right questions.
Well, it's all about the right kind of scale. You know, you ask too narrow a question, you get the obvious, the obvious answer. So if the problem is, I don't know, how do we make this chair more comfortable? But we're asking it, and so how do we make this chair with the same materials, at the same size, more comfortable? It's kind of a hard question to ask in an interesting way. Yeah. But if instead we said, well, how do we sit in different ways, or how might we sit in different ways in order to have a better conversation together? You might come up with you might even not even have a chair at all. We might do something on the floor. We might find all kinds of interesting solutions. So. Yeah. That idea of framing the question so it gives you enough space to go to interesting places. It's a bit of an art form, but the more you practice it, the better you get.
Right. No, that's awesome. And I guess for people that might not be in a very creative job, or so they think, is there a way that you can have innovation and creativity no matter what job you're in?
I'd almost frame it a slightly different way, which is you kind of have to, right? I mean, we live in a world today where change is happening everywhere. Nothing stays the same for very long. So we really need to bring creativity to everything we do, both because it's kind of more enjoyable to live your life that way, in my opinion. It's actually more rewarding to actually try and figure out how things could be different from the way they are. But it's also what we need to do as individuals and organizations if we're going to stay competitive.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what piece of an organization you work in. It could be marketing, it could be HR, it could be anywhere. If you think, there are always ways we can do things in a better way, or do things so that we meet the needs of our customers, whether they're internal customers or customers out of the world, meet them in a better way.
Yeah. And so it's about asking the right questions.
It's about asking the right questions, but it's having that attitude and that confidence that there are better ways of doing things, that just taking the world as it comes is not actually very creative. Challenging assumptions, as I said at the beginning. You know, if we market ourselves in a certain way, if we put books on a shelf in a bookstore in a certain way, well, do we have to do it that way? I remember first time I worked into a bookstore where the folks in there had turned a whole bunch of the books facing forward and then written little reviews and dangled them underneath. Oh, that's much easier now for me to decide which book to buy.
Yeah.
That wasn't the way it was done before. They'd had a creative idea about how to show a book in a bookstore.
Yeah. So tell me, what kind of technologies have you seen? Because we live in a very innovative way in that way. What kind of technologies have you seen that help out with creativity and collaboration?
Well, there are all kinds of technologies around us that help. I mean, some of them are the ones that help us make better connections or compare things. You know, I mean, we've got online technologies today that let us find things on the web and bring them together and sort of curate them and use that creatively, and that's great. I think those little devices we all carry around with us that, you know, we call smartphones, just capturing those moments of how people do things in the world is the start of asking a question about whether it could be different. You know, certainly here at IDEO, we take pictures of everything all the time, and people will come back from trips with lots and lots of pictures, just of people of how people are doing their work or living their lives, and we start wondering, well, does it have to be like that? Could it be different? And those images are the beginnings of that process.
And so if I see in public, I got to be watch out for pictures being taken.
You should expect me to have a camera in my hand. Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah. So for those watching, if you could give one piece of advice, like one golden nugget for everyone to take away that they can apply tomorrow in their job to be more creative, be more innovative, what would that be?
Think of the creative process as starting with a question, not an answer. We think about creativity, the kind of mythology of creativity is all about, I've got an idea. Actually, it's all about, I've got a really interesting question. So go home, go back to work, go back to your office and start wondering about the interesting questions. Because I can assure you, when you have interesting questions, you will get to interesting ideas.
Awesome. And is there a way to speed up the creative process? Like, you know, when you have these questions, is there a way to make it faster?
Well, you know, the process starts with a question. It doesn't end with a question. Obviously, ultimately, you have to get to an idea. So the best way to think about it, it's sort of it's a two-step process. In a way, it's you ask questions, and then you do something as a response to that question in order to explore an idea. You can think of that as an experiment or a prototype. You know, and the faster you can go through that loop, the faster you move towards the ultimate solution. Yeah. Because you can think about the question is the sort of instigator of the creative process, and then the experiment or the prototype, the thing you're going to try, is whether you learn whether that was a good idea or a good question or not. And so your most good ideas take many of those iterations to get to the final thing. So the faster you can do it in a day instead of a week, or an hour instead of a day, then the quicker you're going to get to the solution.
So in a sense, you're not worried about failing in this process, right?
Oh, in fact, people get hung up with the idea of failure, but it's not really failing. It's just learning by doing things over and over again. So every experiment is a learning process, and part of that learning is knowing what doesn't work as well as what does work.
Okay. Well, Tim, thank you so much. I've definitely gotten a lot out of this, and we're going to send it back to Callie now at our headquarters, who's going to introduce the next session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Definitely some very interesting insights from an extremely creative mind. In our next segment, we'll be talking about how to cultivate innovation within our business teams. But first, let's hear how some top IT and business leaders define an innovative company.
I define an innovative company by a company who's willing to take risks. I have a sign that hangs on my door that says safe is risky.
I think an innovative company really has a vision that's aspirational, that it really wants to achieve, but then it has flexibility in terms of how it's going to achieve it.
I think the most important thing is that a company is innovative to serve a purpose.
The main characteristics that I think compose an innovative company is the one that reinvents itself every so often, but without losing its essence.
An innovative company, in my mind, is a company that helps its people fail fast.
The characteristics of an innovative company is a company that is always looking forward, is always leaning into the future.
Innovation is establishing a culture of being willing and able to take the risk of doing things differently, figuring out what works for you, and then reinforcing the ones that are successful.
Our next segment is all about cultivating innovation within business teams. I'm going to turn it over to Googler Brandon Jackson, who is sitting down with Laszlo Bach, head of people operations at Google and author of the new book, Work Rules.
Thanks, Callie. I'm here with Google's Senior Vice President of People Operations and author of Work Rules, insights from Google that will transform how you live and lead. Thanks for joining us, Laszlo.
It's a pleasure to be here, Brandon. Thanks for having me.
Now, naturally, you spend a lot of time, you and your teams, thinking about how to improve the experience of working at Google. But you've gone a step further to actually share those insights with the world. Why now with this book, Work Rules, and what do you hope we can learn from these rules?
Well, I think why now is because I got to thinking, we spend more time working than we do anything else in life. If you add up the hours, no one works a 40-hour week anymore. So you spend more time working than you do sleeping, more time than with your friends, more time than on your hobbies and activities. You spend more time working than you do with the people you love the most. And what occurred to me is that for most people, even in jobs I've had, work is a means to an end. It's not as much fun, it's not inspiring, it's not what it could be and it should be. I mean, bottom line is, work just sucks for too many people. And at Google, one of the things we've seen is there's ways to apply science and some intuition to actually make work better. And in writing the book, one of the things I discovered was that there's a lot of organizations that are doing really compelling things. And if more companies did things like some of these other companies, like Wegmans or Brandix or even Google, the world would actually be a better place. So we thought we'd share that.
So keeping with our theme of innovation, and particularly team innovation, we know that it's a key driver of organic growth for all companies. That's regardless of sector or geography, and PwC surveys confirm that. What is the rule you think has the biggest impact in fostering that culture of team innovation?
I think it's funny because when you talk about innovation, there's all these different models, right? Have a skunk works, have an experimental group, give people 20% time. There's all these mechanisms. And at Google, our answer is to try all of them because there's no single answer. You have to create opportunities for people to create. And the answer is going to depend on what kind of product you have, what kind of environment you have, what kind of people you have. But stepping away from all that, the single biggest thing that drives innovation is making the work mean something, giving people freedom and connecting the work they do to something meaningful. And what's funny is this has been studied for years. Dr. Kamal Birdi of the University of Sheffield, he did a study looking at 308 different companies that tried Six Sigma, statistical process control, all kinds of different innovation techniques to see what works. The only thing that worked, he found, was empowerment. There was another study done by a gentleman out of MIT. He looked at 2 Nike factories in Mexico and 1 t-shirt factories. And one very traditionally managed, the management set goals, told people how to do their jobs. The other factory, they were told, figure out what your quote is, figure out what your goals are. People in that factory produce on average 140 shirts a day versus 80 shirts in the more tightly controlled factory. They were happier, they made more money because they were paid per shirt. And because the margins were the way they were, the company actually made more money. So giving people freedom is incredibly powerful. The other piece of innovation, though, is giving work meaning, because that gives people the motive to actually do great things. Amy Rosinski, a professor at Yale, found that in almost any job you look at, 1/3 of people are able to find some meaning in it. She looked at doctors and lawyers, nurses. She looked at janitors and housekeepers. And what she found was, even among janitors and housekeepers, 1/3 of people find their work meaningful. She looked at a coma ward, and the housekeepers were going around moving paintings around from room to room. And she said, "Why are you doing that?" And they said, "Because I feel like I'm helping these people recover in some small way." And Amy asked them, "You could get fired for this. You could lose your job. Your job is to change bedpans, not change the decor. And they said, I still feel like it's important to give. And the lesson of that is you can find that meaning, that connection to something bigger than ourselves in any job. And if you can draw that connection, people are more productive. And if you give them the freedom to do that, they're happier as well.
I'm curious with those themes though. So freedom and meaning, do you think those apply to all types of workers, even most? For example, there's a growing trend of, I think, a talking point that millennials are kind of this different and unique type of species of a worker. And how do you think they compare with Gen Xers and boomers? And do you think leaders should do anything differently as far as attracting or retaining millennials in particular?
Well, I think actually, I don't think millennials are that different from the rest of us, despite everything that's been written. If you talk to millennials, and there's research on this, what do they want? They want freedom. They want some control over their destiny. They want to do meaningful work. They want some well-being, some balance in their lives. They want to be able to chart their own course. And that sounds kind of weird and different, but I'm now over 40, and I think back to what I wanted when I was 20, and it was all those same things. And when I go ask my dad, what did he want when he was 20? He wanted all the same things too. The only difference today is that millennials are more connected and they're more vocal. But I think they're asking for the same things actually every single one of us want. So I don't think we should manage millennials differently. I think we should manage just about everybody the way the millennials are asking to be managed.
Ah, gotcha. And is there a way you think that you can also foster that innovation with teams that have that diversity, people from all those different generations?
Yeah, I think actually that's a huge strength. You know, there's early research, again, out of MIT, and there's a gentleman there who looked at, named Tom Malone, professor there, and he looked at, does diversity actually matter? And so he looked at gender as an axis, and what he found was that as you get closer to 50-50 balance, team performance actually improves on tests of flexible intelligence. So when you have teams that are different ages or different demographics of however you want to slice it, the best thing you can do, and that we found at Google, is to create an environment of psychological safety where people feel they can bring all of themselves to work. And when you do that, what happens is people actually are more forthcoming with ideas. They create more, they give more, they actually work harder, and you get better outputs from them.
Now, some people watching this may be a little bit skeptical. This is Google, you know, and can we really take these things and apply them elsewhere in the world? But one of your chapters, chapter 12, is a hopeful one, and it talks about how small signals can have a big impact. And I'm curious if you talk about that idea of nudging, anything from in the cafes to promotion nomination decisions. We've seen that here at Google. What's one thing that managers could do tomorrow to improve the happiness and morale of their employees?
That's a great question, because the philosophy in Google, in people operations, in our department is, it's basically that. What is the least we can do to generate the biggest outcome? Because we have 55,000 employees, and going and putting everyone through some kind of management training is just not going to work. It's never worked in almost any environment. So we always try to focus on what's the smallest thing we can do. We did a piece of work called Project Oxygen years ago, which was all about what makes managers effective. And we distilled it down to 8 behaviors, and most of them weren't rocket science. It was things like have one-on-ones, be a coach, clear obstacles. So the synthesis of that, though, the single thing that a manager could do tomorrow to actually make their teams more productive is just to ask their opinions. Ask people, what do you think we should do? Because your bias as a manager, the reason you become a manager is because you've made good decisions in the past, you get rewarded, you get promoted, you make more decisions. The people around us, the sum of their intelligence is way greater than any single person's intelligence. And they want to step up. So instead of making every single decision in your staff meetings or what have you, just say, you know, here's the information we have. What do you think we should do? And listen to them and make some of those decisions based on what they think is right.
That sounds so simple. Do you have a vivid example of when you've just used the data and just given it to the people and that you've seen the big impact?
Well, you know, my favorite example actually comes from a company called Wegmans. Wegmans is a Northeast grocery chain, and anybody who's ever been to a Wegmans is a fanatic. They love this place. They were the #1 best company to work for. They won that the year before Google won it for the first time. And very different environment, 1% margins versus 30% margins, right? Most of the people have a high school education versus people at Google who have advanced degrees. Family-owned firm versus publicly held. We're different in every conceivable way. And yet they trust their people. And it's terrifying at first because, you know, who knows what they're going to do. But I remember their COO, Jack DePeters, telling me the story about a baker. And they get a call, woman says, you know, I've got a wedding tomorrow. My cake didn't come through. Is there anything, do you have a wedding cake? So this baker just starts baking, right? Kind of stays up all night, makes this cake, decorates it, it's beautiful, and the next morning leaves. packs up the cake, puts it in her trunk, drives out 2.5 hours to deliver it, make sure everything's okay. And the bakery was shut down all day long. And when this person came back to work, they were celebrated as a hero. They weren't told you abandoned your post. They weren't told you cost us a day's revenue. They were told that was the right thing to do for the customer. You did exactly the right thing. And that exercise of freedom is incredibly powerful and always pays off.
We're almost out of time, but as we close, you've been the head of People Ops at Google for a number of years now. #1 place to work for by Glassdoor, Fortune. What is your parting advice as far as having impactful and innovative teams?
I think it's some of the stuff we've talked about. Connect people to a mission, give them freedom. The last thing, which we haven't had a chance to talk about, but which I write about, is rely on data. There's a lot of decisions we make based on our gut. The way we interview, the way we hire, the way we promote. At Google, we don't let managers make any of those decisions. We have committees who are dedicated, and their whole job is make a fact-based decision, solving purely for quality. Not is it a friend's son, not is it a friend's daughter, not is it somebody connected to a client, not is it someone like me, but instead make an objective decision based on data and caring about quality instead of trusting our gut. That's the biggest thing I'd add and leave folks with.
Thank you so much.
No, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to turn it back over to Callie, who introduced our next segment as far as taking the innovation of teams and extending that into your business to create industry disruption. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. Excellent advice from Laszlo on how to foster better work teams. I'm actually really excited about Laszlo's new book, Work Rules. A lot of what he writes about is similar to what I write about in my book, Why Work Sucks and How to Fix It. Now, I know what you're thinking. Work sucks, work rules. They seem to be contradictory titles, but the fundamental concepts are absolutely the same. Work should be about finding meaning, about contributing to society, about focusing on a larger outcome. For all of you, work should be about focusing on your results and achieving them every single day in the most productive, efficient ways. Laszlo and I both write about how work culture needs to support technology, which is a lot of what this event is about today. Now, let's hear from some business leaders in terms of how they're finding meaning in their work and how they're using technology to encourage more creative ideas.
How has Google helped us with innovation has been pretty much exponential in terms of our change management practices. People started collaborating together. They started working in teams much more effectively and efficiently than previously. It had been a very sequential process. That benefit, whilst intangible to us at the start, became significantly more aware. And we saw probably an increase of about 10 to 15% in terms of conversion scores when it came to information requests and getting customer orders to come in through the front door.
Apps is a cornerstone of innovation for me. And Google and Google Apps and the entire way of working, it's about a cultural change. And if you don't have a cultural change, it's very hard then to promote innovation inside of any kind of legacy IT organization. Google was the foundation of the cultural revolution that was required for us to make the pivot.
I believe the state of Colorado has been very innovative. We were one of the first states to go forward with Google. So last year in 2014, Colorado was hit by a lot of wildfires, and it caused a lot of disruption in the state. And one of the things that we needed was a tool, a productivity suite, a platform that would help us innovate and solve problems on the scene. And so Google was, fairly new to the state, but we were able to take that suite and use it with first responders. We were able to, before we had no idea what areas had been affected, what areas first responders had been able to go to and see. There was very little information. So by crossing Google Maps API with other pieces of the productivity suite, we were able to do something that's never been done before.
And then finally with Google, it's a company that's so synonymous with innovation, but it really lives and breathes that innovation.
And now we'll move into our last segment. Jess Brown with Google for Work is sitting down with Jonathan Mildenhall, CMO of Airbnb. Jess and Jonathan will be talking about how to actually accomplish business innovation. And Jonathan will be talking with us about how Airbnb disrupted an entire industry and changed the game.
Thanks, Callie, and welcome everyone to our session today on accomplishing business innovation. And also, welcome to the first ever Airbnb listing. What you see around me was based on the founder's home that they first listed on Airbnb. So you get an inside look at where Airbnb started and the culture here. And joining me is Jonathan Mendenhall. He's the Chief Marketing Officer of Airbnb. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you. It's lovely to be here.
Yeah, and I'm going to ask John a series of questions about how Airbnb accomplishes business innovation and his leadership insights. So first, let's dive in and take a step back to think about all the businesses you've been exposed to, maybe the companies that you really admire, and what about them makes them innovative? What are the characteristics of an innovative company?
I've observed two approaches to innovation over the past kind of decade. And for me, I have noticed that you have kind of corporate innovation and then you have entrepreneurial innovation. So let me just unpack both of those for you. Corporate innovation is usually driven by market research, and you get a lot of data analysts that spend a lot of time looking at a space in a marketplace that they can build a product and then serve that particular consumer group. Unfortunately, from my experience, that only leads to kind of small incremental innovation. It doesn't ever lead to great disruptive step change innovation. And then you have entrepreneurial innovation, and entrepreneurs rarely use market research and market data at all. What they do is they come up with an idea, and they have an instinct that over time that idea will stick in the marketplace and become a huge disruptive idea. And that's really what happened at Airbnb. If you take a look at the founders and their original efforts to actually launch Airbnb into the world, they actually went around each and every listing in New York with cameras to photograph each and every listing because they had an instinct that great photographed homes would actually do very, very well on the digital platform. Now, no market research, no data could have ever suggested that that was the right approach, but actually it was that approach that led to the phenomenon that is Airbnb. Another amazing difference about entrepreneurial innovation versus corporate innovation is really the patience that entrepreneurs have to iterate their ideas once launched in the marketplace. And corporate companies don't necessarily have exactly the same patience. So one of the pieces of advice that our founders got when they were originally launching Airbnb was from Paul Graham at Y Combinator. And he told them to actually do things that don't scale. And he was of the advice that it was better to have 100 people really love Airbnb than 1,000 people just like Airbnb. And what he said is, what we should do is over-invest in those 100 people, because then they'll become fantastic advocates and champions and use their word of mouth as a really, really effective marketing channel for Airbnb. Now, corporate companies wouldn't really know how to do that, and corporate companies, by very nature of the scale of their businesses, looking for massive consumer adoption quite quickly. And so corporate companies are looking for 1,000 people to like them as opposed to 100 people to love them. And that, again, is a huge difference between the approach to innovation and customer relationships in the initial phase of a company from an entrepreneurial company as opposed to a corporate company.
Excellent. So really it's about having that quality innovation versus the quantity of mass customers and really focusing.
Exactly right, exactly right. Make a few people really love you and then learn why they love you and then scale that. And that can lead to a beautiful business model that has real consumer stickiness at the heart of it.
Wonderful, excellent advice. And how has Airbnb taken the steps, maybe tactical steps, to make sure employees keep that entrepreneurial focus and culture going?
The single most important aspect of Airbnb is our culture. Airbnb has a culture of creativity and innovation baked into it. And I've only been here a year, But I was really, really intrigued when I was being interviewed by Airbnb as to really how authentic was the culture. I mean, as soon as I stepped into these offices in San Francisco, it was like, this place is like a place I've never been as far as a work environment's concerned. But I wanted to really, really kind of stress test the culture. And so I did my research, and again, it was a really interesting piece of advice that the founders got a few years ago when Peter Thiel invested $150 million in Airbnb. And the founders asked him the question. They said, what one thing should we be most worried about? And he turned around and he said, guys, don't F up the culture. And what he meant by that is he, as a serial investor, he'd seen so many companies that actually lose their sense of mission, purpose, or values as they continue to scale. And it was such a significant thing for our founders to hear that Brian Chesky, the chief exec, actually ended up writing a blog post entitled "Don't F Up the Culture." And you can Google search it because it's quite an inspirational blog post from a chief exec. And basically, the premise is that the culture is really, really, really important, because the culture becomes an incubator for creativity and innovation and ultimately, you know, kind of business performance. So the great thing about culture is it's not just top down, it's also bottoms up. So for a company like Airbnb, culture manifests itself in our meeting rooms, the food that we eat, the way that we get together on a weekly basis and have happy hour, the kind of creative excellence that we use as external benchmarks. All of these things drive culture. And one of the most important things that anybody does when they actually join Airbnb is our onboarding is really a week of cultural immersion, so that you come out of that feeling that you can become a true kind of ambassador for the culture of Airbnb, regardless of where in the world you might work.
Interesting. So as a leader, how do you maintain that cultural core, especially at Airbnb or maybe other companies that you worked with? I know you were an executive at Coke. So how do you, as a leader, strengthen the culture? What can you do?
Well, personally, I have three mantras that I hold dear and try and bring with me each and every day. The first is the power of belief, and I genuinely believe that if you believe it, then it can become a reality. And so I'm a big, big champion of getting my team to dream openly and share their dreams and, you know, develop these big, audacious North Stars that we might never reach, but actually the journey of trying to reach a North Star is exciting and rewarding in itself. So belief is my number one. And secondly, creativity. Everybody has a responsibility to be creative. In whatever job you do, whether it's finance, or whether it's HR, or whether it's admin, or whether it is marketing, then bringing your full creative self to your work can really kind of create a step change in progress. And then finally, humanity. I think that it's really, really important that even though it's difficult to practice in the moment, that we all bring empathy and compassion to the workplace. And I think if you've got belief, you've got creativity, and you've got humanity, then that in itself can create a wonderful framework for a really dynamic and innovative culture.
Wonderful. That's really inspiring. So Jonathan, throughout this broadcast, we've talked a lot about creativity, and at Airbnb, you have that at your core. How do you balance the priority of creativity with meeting your quarterly goals and getting the job done?
It's a brilliant question because it's really, really hard. On the one hand, here I am at Airbnb leading what I'm hoping will become one of the most disruptive and radical and creative marketing agendas on the planet. And yet at the same time, if I'm going to be successful at proving out that marketing agenda, I actually have to build systems and processes so that the marketing agenda can both scale around the world. Right now I have 140 people. By the end of the year I'll have 200 people, you know, driving the marketing agenda all around the world. And at the same time we're investing hundreds of millions of dollars on marketing. And so I need to prove to all the shareholders that the way that we're investing our marketing dollars is actually delivering very, very clear ROI. And so, you know, building the systems of a world-class marketing organization that are driving quarterly objectives, that are driving quarterly goals, that are delivering measurable results, and inspiring a bunch of creative radicals to do the most disruptive marketing possible, reconciling those two agendas is really, really hard. And I've heard people talk about the fact that sometimes with entrepreneurial companies, you have to kind of build the plane whilst flying it at the same time. And for the first time in my life, I realized exactly what that means and quite how challenging it is to do.
So with this orchestration, how do you think about hiring the right talent in order to ensure you're going to keep the culture and meet business goals?
It's really interesting because I'd say the one thing that has changed over the past couple of years is our talent profile at Airbnb. Again, a decision that was driven by the founders. Let's recruit people who have an awful lot of experience at running their specific disciplines. So whether it's general counsel or head of HR or head of hospitality or myself, head of marketing, they've made a conscious choice to bring people in that have, you know, decades of experience. But not just traditional experience. It's really, really important that we take a look at the experience and measure how disruptive or how innovative or how creative all of the people who are joining the company have actually been. So we're going for traditional experience, but that experience has to have a flavor of risk-taking and a flavor of innovation kind of baked into it. And that's what I look for when I'm looking at people's resumes. I'm looking for, yeah, they've run interesting brands, and most importantly, they've done really interesting things with those interesting brands.
Yeah, excellent. And I think it's interesting that it goes back to your answer to our first question, in that entrepreneurial spirit that you think innovative companies have. That's the main characteristic, so that's what you look for in your employees.
It's exactly right. You know, you can come from a corporate or you can come from a startup, but you have to have proven out innovation.
Yeah, so at the core, you need to be an innovator.
That's right.
Excellent. So final question here, and very practical question, a takeaway for our audience. What can someone do right now in order to have a more innovative business? What's the first step they can take?
Without question, the most important lesson that anybody could take away from this is if you genuinely want to create a culture of innovation and a culture of hypergrowth, then you have to really embrace risk and all that that entails. And it's not just good enough to actually stand up there and say, yeah, we celebrate risk takers. You actually have to demonstrate which people or which teams have actually taken risks and be prepared to celebrate both failure and success. And I believe in a kind of monthly ritual, which is, you know, our fabulous failures, which is where we basically talk about the ideas that perhaps didn't kind of succeed in the way that we'd planned. But the most important thing is actually learning from those failures and scaling the learning around the organization. And a truthful thing happens. The more a company celebrates failure, the more confident a company gets in taking risks. And the more confident a company gets in taking risks, the more successful those risks are. And so it's slightly unexpected logic, but it's logic that has proven out to be incredibly effective for me.
Wow, great takeaways. So taking smart risks and then learning from your failures.
Exactly right.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time, Jonathan. We really appreciate your insights.
Not at all. Thank you. It's been great to be here.
All right. So Callie, let me throw it back to you, and let's wrap up this session on creating a culture of innovation.
Thank you, Jess, and thank you to all of our speakers. From this session, we've learned that innovation starts with us. We can inspire and lead our teams and ultimately have great impact on our businesses. Innovation doesn't need to be about going from 0 to 60 in a short amount of time, but the very first steps depend on your willingness to think creatively and innovate boldly. Which brings us to the second half of today's event, where we offer you 2 custom tracks depending on your area of interest. One track is all about team collaboration and how to have productive teams. The other track is on technology and making sure you innovate securely with the right tools. Each track features amazing Google for Work customer stories, so take your pick. In these 2 sessions, you will be able to use the Q&A feature right here on the Atmosphere platform with live Googlers standing by to answer your questions. Thank you for spending time with us thus far and learning how to think creatively and innovate boldly. Enjoy the rest of the event with your custom track of choice.